Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. I've said it over and over for more than 7 years now. I am interested in that space where experience and creativity connect, the intersection between life and art, between what we live and what we make out of it. I talk to hundreds of people about their work and their lives, that place where they overlap, and how one informs the other. Last week, I even told you the story of how these conversations have influenced my own creative work. When I started doing these interviews, my guest today, Michael Mayo, was barely out of his teens. Yet somehow, of all of the people I've spoken to, he seems to have one of the most thoughtful, nuanced, and mature sensibilities when it comes to how personal identity communicates with creative identity. His new record, Bones, came out this week, but he released a few singles during the COVID year, including this one called You and You.
In time, maybe I can find a life in open doors, engrossed in chords. The known is more misleading. I've grown with the unknown in me. The tale is quick to tell itself, given the chance. Your health is in my hands. You've put my words on a pedestal. You wanna get closer to me, but you need a remedy for all of the drama between you and you. You wanna get closer to me, but you need a remedy for all of the drama between you and you. You wanna get closer to me, but you need a remedy for all of the drama between you and you. You wanna get closer to me, but you need a remedy for all of the drama between you and you.
Out of respect and deference to Michael's own suspicions when it comes to labels, I am not going to label him here. But I will say this. I love what he does. He's an absolutely brilliant improvising singer. His technique and control are kind of stunning, actually. He's not afraid to take risks on stage or on social media, where he can often be found sharing his improvising practice. He grew up in a musical family. Both of his parents are professional, working musicians and singers in LA. He's a songwriter. He's a teacher. He's been a backing vocalist himself to pop stars. He's a collaborator. He's a gamer. He loves video games. He's active on Twitch, which I have learned is the world's leading live streaming platform for gamers and the things they love. He filled me in a bit on that community in our conversation here today. He also told me about his band Shrek is Love, dedicated to the movie Shrek. He's an openly bisexual black artist, which is, despite so much progressive chatter about inclusion and acceptance, still not very common today. Michael says that although he's all about the music, he's also more than willing to be a role model if that's what's needed, because he didn't have any role models who looked like him when he was growing up, and it was isolating. This is the kind of conversation that I love to have. So free, so open, so exploratory. I know we didn't get into everything, but what we did get into was comfortable, even when it wasn't. Here he talks about managing his relationship with social media, which he describes as finding the balance between staying sane and being seen. We talked about that gray area between sharing process and doing performance. He shared his thoughts on everything from live looping to by erasure, from shedding giant steps to generational trauma. Third-story.com is the place to go to sign up, subscribe, get involved. As usual, this week I have curated a Spotify playlist and some YouTube clips that relate to our conversation, and you should check out the archive while you're there. Previous episodes with Becca Stevens, Satchel Vasandani, Jacob Collier, Imogen Heap, Louis Cole, Louis Cato come to mind and relate nicely to our conversation today. I could go on and on, there are so many, but you can check it all out yourself, and while you're there, hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you like it, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps. It helps other people find it. And of course, there's Patreon. Patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast is the place for you to go to spend all that unemployment money before it runs out. Here's me and Michael Mayo talking it down. I feel like for some people, you're like an obvious fact of life, already, and then for other people, you are a really well kept secret. I think you're like teetering on the edge right now of there are people who are like so into it and know followers and engaging with you, and then I'm also kind of amazed at how you still have a lot of people to convince, and I feel like this is the year for you to like cross over.
It's funny because that's sort of like the purpose of this album. I mean, one of the many purposes of this album. People have been asking me for a long time, friends and family and peers and stuff, like, when's your album coming out? When are you going to finally make your album? Because I've been doing stuff for a long time now, and it just never felt right. But eventually, when I finally made the decision to, and we made it, I like looked back at my career, not to like do the self horn toot or whatever, but I'm like, man, I've been like low key kind of doing stuff, and I don't have an album out yet. Like, I should probably do one of those.
It's a pretty unusual way to approach it. When you say that it didn't feel right or didn't make sense for a long time, what do you mean? What does that mean?
I think for me, for a long time, I tended to be very wanting to placate what I thought others wanted from me, be it like musically or personally or whatever. And so I knew that I didn't want to exist in that space when I made my first album. And so it just took some time for growth for me to get there. Also, I knew that because I was, closeted for a long time, and I knew that I wanted to start my like album project journey, I guess, living authentically, and I didn't want to sort of set the tone of having something be cast in shadow or doubt. I wanted to sort of like hit the ground running, essentially.
You felt that you were placating both musically and personally, and you sort of had to get over both of those hurdles. Kind of sounds like you did them to some extent simultaneously. Do you feel like you had to address the personal aspect before you were able to address the musical aspect?
I actually think it was flipped. So around the time I was in college, I went to the New England Conservatory of Music in Boston for my undergrad. That's where my mind started to be open to a lot of new stuff musically, and just being surrounded by, classical music and contemporary improvisation. And like, there's a lot of really amazing music in Boston. I realized that a lot of the ideas that I had held about like jazz and, going into college, I was like, I'm going to become a straight ahead jazz singer because that's all there is. And that's all I want to do. And I had very strict ideas about if you sing in this particular style, if you use this particular inflection, that's not jazz, that's R&B or that's gospel or whatever. And that is mutually exclusive from jazz. And after a while, I realized that that's just limiting, and all of these sort of perceptions of genre. All genre is a describer. I don't think it should like prescribe behavior. And so it took me some time to sort of realize that. And then by the time I got to grad school, that was when I really started to expand and open up. And that was at the Thelonious Monk Institute.
You went to college with these prescribed ideas of music. And I don't want to lose the thread because I think it's really interesting, the idea that music, liberating yourself musically, can also then help to kind of open up a way for you to do the same thing personally.
Totally.
But before we get there, I mean, I think you're kind of an unusual case also in that you grew up around music. Your parents are both musicians and singers, and still you carried some sort of burden of genre or category into your creative life.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think it really came once I started learning about jazz. And there's nothing intrinsic to the music of jazz that makes it feel more constrictive. But I will say that I think, unfortunately, in a lot of jazz academia, there tends to be a lot of restrictive thinking and a lot of sort of dogmatic education. And to me, that is like, by definition, antithetical to the root of jazz. Like, the root of jazz is freedom. It's a proclamation, a declaration of freedom. And so, like, growing up with my parents both being musicians, they were never at all strict about you have to do this or you can't do this. If anything, they were always trying to encourage me to follow my ear and explore. And I've always been a very curious person and a very sort of, I've always loved to explore. But I think for me, when I started learning jazz, I got really excited about it and I wanted to make sure that I did it right. And when you're 14, like, you see the world with much less nuance. So for me, it was like black and white. It's like you listen to Ella Fitzgerald and you follow exactly what she does, Is that what you heard? What did you hear? What were your first jazz records that you heard that opened you up like that? When I started learning jazz in high school, my granny, my mom's mom, gave me this like epic Ella Fitzgerald best of collection that was like 200 songs, and I just like soaked it up. And like I heard her How High the Moon, and it just like destroyed me. I was like, what? So there was that. There was Sarah Vaughan live at Mr. Kelly's. My dad actually had me learn Wynton Kelly's solo on Freddie Freeloader from Kind of Blue. That's actually the first jazz solo I ever learned.
Did he give you any tools to unlock how to mimic like an instrument with your voice? There's all of the assumed knowledge around what the sort of scat language is that you learn later on as a singer. But what sounds were you making when you learned to sing the solo?
It was so long ago, and actually it was before I even started high school. So I started like really studying jazz when I went to high school. I went to the LA County High School for the Arts. And back then it was like, if you're a vocal student, there's the opera department or the jazz department. And so going into school, I knew I wanted to go into the jazz department. And so upon finding that out, my dad was like, here's this record, check it out. Why don't you learn this solo? And he didn't really give me any sort of guidelines. I think he just wanted to see what I would make of it. And so from what I remember, I think I was mostly doing like a da, 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 without any sort of like variation. But it was a really great introduction too. And I haven't really thought about it very much, but I've always been very sort of egalitarian with like listening to vocal music versus instrumental music. I've never really cared one way or the other. And I think that might have had something to do with it, that my very first jazz solo ever of any kind was instrumental.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting when it comes to scat in particular, and I think even scat singers, particularly contemporary singers who sing jazz and improvise jazz, there is a kind of a burden because there are a handful of people who develop the language. Same as there are on the saxophone or whatever. I mean, you're going to have to confront Charlie Parker one way or the other if you're going to play jazz saxophone. But particularly as a singing improviser, there are certain customs, assumptions about how it's done. And when I talk to other improvising singers, I feel that they've all sort of had to deal with that one way or the other, whether you're going to embrace it or reject it or choose which parts of it to keep. Everybody has to sort of climb that mountain on their own.
Totally. I mean, the syllables discussion is definitely one that I've thought about a lot. And I've always been of the mind that experimentation is the way to unlock anything, especially in improvisation-based music. And so something especially that I have my students do is, because this question comes up all the time, right? It's like, well, if I'm learning the solo, especially if it's instrumental, because if it's vocal, you can just learn what they're doing. But if it's instrumental, what do I do? And I'm like, okay, so before I tell you what I would do, I kind of do what my dad did. I just want to see, if you learn these notes, what is natural to come out for you? Mm-hmm. And then I'll do a thing where I have them go through the alphabet and sing the whole solo on like a ba 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 ba, then a ka 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 ka, then a da 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 da, and see what starts to feel right. Mm-hmm. And slowly but surely, because I'm not in their mind, so I can't know what resonates for them when they do it. But slowly but surely, they start to unlock the sounds that feel right for them. I think I like to learn from the greats, but I also always keep in mind that before any given like artistic thing happened, people existed already. So like, just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it can't be done, basically.
Your dad gave you the record, your grandmother gave you the Ella Fitzgerald, you had support from the family. What did you see from them? What did a life in music look like to you? What did a relationship with music look like to you when you were a kid?
To me, it was always like, I often compare it to, if a kid has a parent who's a doctor, then they become a doctor, right? Like it sort of just makes sense to them because they see a living example of it every day. For me, it was that. Like, I never had any doubt that it was possible to have a successful career in music, and to be like happy and like fine, basically. So, my parents would go to rehearsals and shows and tours, and they would take me with them. Like I went on tour with my mom when she would be touring with Luther Vandross and Whitney Houston. I went on tour with my dad a couple times, and just like going to their gigs, and especially going with them to recording sessions. Like I learned sort of studio etiquette at a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
And also growing up in LA, like the studio music scene out there is really huge. And so I grew up doing session work, singing on like soundtracks and movies and stuff. And I think for me, growing up in LA, the thing that's really cool about LA and the session music scene is that from day to day, you're doing completely different stuff. So like I would go with my mom to like a gospel session one day, and then with my dad to like a country session the next day, and then a blues session, and just seeing like, oh wow, they're operating at both my parents are very good at what they do, and so they're operating at a very high level, and they're able to function within a lot of different contexts. And I sort of took that on for myself because I love existing in multiple worlds. There's something that's so exciting to me about really being able to embody different musical vibes. And I think a lot of that got started just like coming up with them.
Do you have siblings?
No, just me.
Do you think they were looking for you to be creative, to be musical, hoping that you would be?
Yeah, I would say, if I had to guess, because I've sort of talked to them about this, they were always really supportive of me growing up, so I never like had any doubts about that. But I found out a little bit when I got a little bit older a couple years ago. I asked my mom, I'm like, did you know that I was always going to be a singer? She's like, I did, but I kind of, in a way, didn't want you to, because, like, obviously there's all the uncertainty and you never know like where the next paycheck's coming from. And so I think even for them, they're like, we maybe want him to pick something that's a little bit more stable and secure. But I also know that they like, not in terms of like financial pragmatism,
Mm-hmm.
but just in terms of like fun. I know they definitely wanted me to be creative. My dad, especially, he was always like playing me like Count Basie and all these different, great people. So yeah, it's interesting because, like I said, I never felt an energy of like, we don't want you to do this. But a few years ago when she told me that, I was like, wow, really? I never would have guessed.
I get it. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and the thought of her spending a life filled with uncertainty even though that's how I spend my life and that's how my wife spends her life, I still feel like, oh, it would be great if she had stability. I mean, it's hard not to feel that way as a parent.
Totally. I mean, I definitely get it. And I would, I mean, I don't have any kids, but I would probably feel the same way.
You describe their kind of professional life as being, it's not transactional, but there is a kind of an aspect of artisan professionalism. You get called for the gig, you go in, you can sort of pivot from one genre to another. The expectations are there, and you're living a slightly different version of that life because at this moment you're very committed to this kind of unique, singular, artistic approach. You're also teaching and you do other gigs, but it's not exactly the same as doing session work and backing vocal work.
And that was one of the main things when I moved here, when I moved to New York 4 or 5 years ago, that was kind of part of my thought process behind it. Because like I said, when I was in LA, I was doing the session singer thing, and I really enjoy that. I think it's really fun. Like obviously everything has its stuff. But overall, I've always found it to be really rewarding for all the previously mentioned reasons. But I have also always wanted to do my own thing more.
Mm-hmm.
There's just something that I really like about writing my own music and playing it and traveling as like a byproduct of like music that I've made. I think is one of the most rewarding things for me. And so, you never know where the future may lead. I plan on moving back to LA eventually. And I always, like I said, I love making music. I love to sing. So, I've done background gigs where I'm singing back up with some friends, and that's really fun. I've done session stuff, and that's really fun. So I would probably not say that I'm anti that world. It's just not my main priority.
After going through NEC and then the Monk Institute, at some point you realized that you could give yourself permission to bring in all of these influences and all of these identities into kind of what you do. Was it met with resistance, considering you're kind of in a jazz-centric environment? Did you get any feedback that maybe that would be difficult for you as a jazz artist if you were trying to exist in that space?
Not really. Honestly, like I was really fortunate in my like scholastic choices. NEC. So I studied with a lot of different people while I was there, but the vocal teacher there, her name is Dominique Eade. She's amazing. And her teaching style worked really well for me. And it helped open my mind, like I said, to a lot of new stuff. And I think she has such a spirit of curiosity and like student mindedness that I always felt like any sort of thing that I wanted to try was on the menu, basically. And then when I got to the Monk Institute, that is, it's a 2-year program, and it's our year was 7 people, and you're playing together all the time. Wow. And you go to school together, and like you live together. I mean, like it's separate apartments, like 2 per apartment, basically. But essentially you live together, play together, and learn together. So it's like a really intimate setting. And I think, obviously there's growing pains. Like you spend enough time around anyone, like you're going to start to get on each other's nerves, lovingly so. But I think the dynamic of that program really allowed me and us to dive in a way that you might not normally get to when you like have a gig. Like, let's play through this tune a couple times and then hit and then wait till the next gig, right? We got to really craft each song and take time. And then we had artists in residence come through every so often, every other week or so. So this is like Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, Luciana Souza, Gretchen Parlato, like the list goes on and on. The cool thing about that is that we are the stationary group, right? So we're sort of there and we're set, and then people come in and out, and then we can sort of take what we want from their approaches. And that like really helped me see things in a more like macro way. So I never really, aside from like little social media haters, which like they don't matter, I never really had any sort of negative feedback about wanting to go in these different directions, thankfully.
Who were the 7? Who was your team at the Monk Institute?
At the Institute? Yeah. Daniel Rotem on tenor saxophone, Christian Human on drums, who I have a band called Shrek is Love, where all of our music is about the movie Shrek. And Christian plays in that band. Alex Bonham on bass, Carmen Stoff on piano, David Otis on alto sax, and Ido Meshulam on trombone. Really, really great team of people.
I know they think I'm just a simple man.
You have a band called Shrek is Love, dedicated to Shrek,
who always spends his quiet nights alone.
And you also have a very active Twitch life, it seems like.
Hiding away inside the foliage.
I don't know anything about Twitch. I just went and tried to check your Twitch scene out.
And shutting out the moonlight from the sky.
To figure out where that fits in your life.
I know. That I'll always stay the same. But baby, I will come.
I feel like such a grandpa asking you to do this for me, but can you kind of explain to me what that community is for you and
what
how
even what even is?
Yeah.
Twitch, it's hard to, I mean, like, it's not one thing. I think any social media platform, it's like a vast array of people with a lot of different interests. But Twitch started as a platform for gamers to gather and for people to stream their gameplay and like talk and give commentary while they're playing. I think sort of the main comparable thing would be to hang out with someone in their room, but you're not actually physically with them. And now it's sort of turned into not necessarily only gaming. People make music, people make art. There's like people that do woodwork, DJs, people that go on there just to talk. There's like political commentators on there. It's a really robust community. Video games have always been a thing that I've done ever since I was little. And so when I started getting into Twitch, I'm like, I can play music and video games, like my 2 favorite things, put them together, and you get Twitch. I've loved to explore the community. I'm still pretty new. I started streaming last year. It's a really awesome place with a lot of really cool creative people.
Because it started as a gaming community, even the woodworkers and the artisans and the musicians, do they all sort of have a shared affinity for gaming? Do you think that is that sort of underlying everything else?
I would say, like, if we're looking at a percentage as compared to like a YouTube or an
Yeah.
Instagram, then probably yes, but definitely not everyone. In fact, like I have friends that started streaming last year who are not gamers, but they've been like doing well on Twitch. I think it's really just about creating and curating your own community, and people basically like people on Twitch are just there for the hang.
Yeah.
And it's cool because it's casual. People can support you to the extent that they want to, but there's like the core of it is still gaming.
You have on your YouTube channel, for example, there's like 5 videos. There's like the 3 singles from your new record, Bones, which we'll talk about, and a couple other things. That's like a very formal space. That's a very intentional, curated space.
Yeah.
But then you have Instagram and Twitch and TikTok and all these other places where you're like working out small ideas regularly and freely and casually. And in a sense, that actually gives one a better sense of what you're up to and what you're thinking about, it seems to me, or as good a sense, as going to the YouTube channel. And that's interesting. Like how is that built into your life? How much time are you spending making things for social media? How do you think about doing that?
Sure.
How do you approach it?
My relationship with social media has definitely, goes through phases. Like social media is a bear. You know what I mean? Like there's no way you can't really work around it. In a way, like I've sort of had to change the way that I interact with it so that I can like remain sane, but also remain seen. So like when I first started getting into Instagram, because I was very anti-Instagram for a while before I moved to New York, I was like, all it is a place to take pictures. I like having pictures, but I don't like taking pictures. It takes me out of the moment, blah, blah, blah. I was like 20, 21 and jaded. And finally, when I moved to New York, I realized that you can post videos. And that's when I started getting even more into looping. And so my first like several videos on Instagram are all just like random loops that I made with my looper, all very like lo-fi. But, people started responding to that. And I realized that the thing I like about it is exactly like you said, it's a way to sort of workshop ideas. And it's a way, once I realized that like a lot of people that were coming to my shows had like found me on Instagram. Yeah. I didn't even think that was a thing. At first when I used it, it wasn't for the purpose of like getting followers as much as just to put stuff up for my own like practice. And then I did a couple shows and people are like, oh, I saw you on Instagram. That's why I came to your show. I'm like, oh, damn, this is like real life, right? So now I've started doing this thing where instead of setting out to create a post for a given social media, I'll just like practice. I'll be working on music. And then if I have a cool idea, I'll be like, this is a contender for social media. And then I go, because I found that if I start off with the intention of posting, then it just becomes really pandery and it doesn't feel honest. And, it's similar to what we were talking about before with trying to placate other people. Like whenever I feel myself going into that space, I know that that's like not the way to go.
Yeah.
And so, so that's what I started doing with Instagram and a little bit with TikTok, which I'm new to. I just like to use social media as a way to remind myself that I'm not alone, especially since COVID, and seeing other people's stuff inspires me to make my own stuff. And it's kind of like this positive feedback loop.
I think that subtlety between practice and sharing is, I haven't heard it described that way, although I totally relate to it, right? Like, you kind of know that you're going to share something. And on a certain level, even if it is a bear that you have to deal with for professional reasons, as you say, it's also connection. Like you want to make something and then get that feedback from people that enjoy it or see it. And, we thrive on that regardless of what we tell ourselves. Like you need that. And there's no gigs right now. There haven't been really gigs. So like that's what you get. Mm-hmm. But the intention of walking into a room and saying to yourself, I'm going to make an Instagram post as opposed to I'm going to practice. Because if you think about it, practice for years was not meant to be shared. Practice was meant to prepare you for when you do the sharing, for when you do the performing. And now they're kind of intertwined. And so I appreciate that distinction that you make. You need to start out with a certain amount of authenticity and then decide, is this something that you would want to share?
Yeah. And it's funny, like, everybody is different. And I have some friends that are really good at content creation for the purpose of content creation. And I like that is super not me. Like I've tried and you know, I can create something in a pinch, and I know how to make something that like feels good, but I don't want to just make something that like sounds good. I want to make something that like feels good to make. I'm a firm believer that the energy that goes into making something has a large part to do with the energy that people receive from it when they're experiencing it. Um, and you know, not everybody's attuned to that, but I would much rather enjoy the process of making something than like feeling like I'm sort of like beholden to the social media gods.
What about the level of execution? I think sometimes also people respond to imperfection or when the little rough edge is still exposed. Do you think about whether or not you achieved what you wanted to achieve?
Yeah, it varies from video to video. Like, I definitely have the like neurosis meter that like once it passes a certain threshold, I'm like, no, we're done. Like, we have to just like accept it how it is or stop. And I started, I think maybe a couple months ago. I don't know what time is it. Could have been 5 years ago, for all I know, but I'm pretty sure it was 2021. I started doing these Instagram lives and posting them after the fact. That it's literally just me on this keyboard, like playing and singing, and working ideas out. And I remember the first couple ones that I did, I was like, is this too casual? Like, is this like so casual in a way that, you know, takes away the magic or whatever, you know, the suspended belief of seeing someone on a stage or on a screen or something. And I realized that like I've never really given much of a shit, if I can use such French.
Use it all.
I don't really care about that. And I think for a long time I was sort of, people really want you to care about that. They want you to think that the only way to be as a performing artist is to have an air of mystery. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with an air of mystery. And I like to have that from time to time, but I don't think it's necessary all the time. So I think that those imperfections and those blips and those like hiccups kind of contribute to the overall vibe that people receive from you. It's kind of like Twitch. Like, people just want to hang out with you and like know what your vibe is. And I think that really helps contribute to that.
Well, and that's a little new, right? Like the sharing of the process, people watching you develop. I saw a video of you doing a looped version a cappella of Giant Steps.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to say, I had a lot of questions when I watched that about what you had gone through to develop that arrangement. And on the one hand, I would have loved to have seen video of you working it out. And on the other hand, I'm really happy that I didn't, you know, because I got to just experience it and all of the surprise of it. I have a feeling that you had probably spent some time working that out and developing that approach. And I'm kind of glad that as a viewer, as a listener, I just got to experience that without having hung out with you, you know, for hours while you were doing it. Because it takes something away from the magic sometimes when you see how the cake is baked.
How the sausage is made?
Yeah.
That particular arrangement, I made that right after I had moved to New York, before I had any gear. All I had was a melodica and a laptop and a looper. It started out as me just like wanting a way to shed Giant Steps. I just wanted to practice improvising over it. It literally came about out of necessity because I couldn't play the chords, and it would have taken so long to like do the musical typing thing on Logic or something, and to input all these chords via MIDI. It just was more work than I was willing to do. So I was like, let me just like lay this down vocally and then practice over that. And it sort of just became, you know, it started as a thing, and I'm like, okay, so now I can solo over this, and I'm like, actually, this is kind of a vibe. It kind of just like became a vibe. And then I asked one of my roommates at the time, I was like, if you heard this at a show, would you get bored by the time the melody finally came in? Like, would it feel like years had passed, or would you stay engaged the whole time? He's like, no, I was definitely engaged when you were doing that. And so I was like, great, I'm going to try this out. Since then, I've just been doing it. And it's just funny that it started as a way to practice rather than a thing that I was like purposely trying to compose.
That speaks to, though, a limitation in looping that I've always wondered about. You know, by the time you build the thing in real time, in order to just lay the foundation that you want to work over, the audience has been living with the thing for so long. And especially if there's no B section or other place to go, I mean, the limitation is amazing, but it kind of locks you up in ways. How do you think about working around looping in a way that's dynamic and interesting and compelling?
It's absolutely something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think that limitation is one of the main sort of issues with looping. Is this idea is you can add as many layers as you want, but music exists in time, right? Time passes as you're making these things. And so like you have to consider the people that are listening to it, and you have to consider human interest and like what, you know, especially now our attention spans are so short. Like, how can I make a loop that doesn't bore people on the way to the song starting? And so for me, I had to sort of do a paradigm shift when I started looping, where it's like, it's not like, hold, please talk amongst yourselves while I get this thing, and then like, now let's start. The music has already started when you start the first loop. And so you want to create something that's engaging from the get-go. You sort of have to create a hierarchy of like, what do I as a composer need to be heard? There's this one little twiddly-do thing that sounds really cool, but if it's not there, the whole vibe of the music isn't going to change. So it's not going to be as important as like the bass line, right? And you also don't have to have everything in from the very beginning. I think that's a common misconception with looping too, is this idea that like all of your parts need to be there, and then you sing the melody and then it's over. I like to have like maybe 3 out of 10 parts at the beginning, then sing some of the melody, then add parts 4 and 5, then sing some more of the melody, because that's what contributes to that feeling of like build and arc. Looping is like infinitesimal more than infinite, right? But within that, like there's so many possibilities that you can do, but it's kind of like you have to prioritize. You have to sort of go in like thinking a little bit.
It's interesting that you say that about allowing yourself to edit your ideas, and maybe you have something that you really love, but take into consideration that the audience is going to have to watch you make it, and so maybe you can afford not to do that. Because I saw in a video that you made a few years ago on YouTube and I was really struck by it, that maybe you put 4 or 5 layers at the front, and one of the layers is you just going shh, or some kind of like percussion thing, you know. And given the fact that each one of your ideas is really deliberate, it speaks highly of, you know, your understanding, or at least in that moment, that the percussion or some sonic element that isn't harmonic or melodic is also really crucial to making this thing feel right. That you would take a cycle just to put some sort of like percussive texture in it, because that was achieving something that you wanted people to feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's really necessary. Reductively speaking, the 3 most basic elements of music are melody, rhythm, and harmony. So you can have all the chords in the world, but if there isn't any sort of percussive element, some sort of like note-specific element that has some sort of attack and release, then it's just going to be like an amalgam of floaty nothing, right? Floaty nothing. So, right? Nothing. Nothing.
I think that we have only scratched the surface of your technical approach to what you do, but it's enough of an indication of how thoughtful you are about your craft and how much sort of digging around in the dirt you have been doing.
I like to dig.
Now, I guess the other piece of it that was introduced in the first couple of minutes of the conversation is the idea that you have had to confront this kind of personal part of your life also. And in some ways, coming into your own musically opened up some possibility for you to then kind of publicly claim your personal life, in general, your sexuality. But it also seems like maybe that came hand in hand with writing and figuring out what you wanted to say in the music.
Yeah, I would agree with that. A lot of my journey when it came to coming out had a lot to do with just like understanding that it is possible to do that. You know, because growing up, you convince yourself that there is no world, there is no future where you're out and living authentically, where you're also like safe and alive. I've been fortunate enough to live in generally very liberal places. I mean, even still, like, obviously, like, a narrative can convince you that you're in danger. Like, an internal ego narrative can convince you you're in danger, even when you're not. So just because you're physically safe doesn't necessarily mean you believe that you are, right? And so I think a lot of my journey was about coming to terms with the fact that it actually is okay for me to be who I am and exist authentically and not hide, and to be okay. And I think musically, like we were saying before, they sort of mirror each other in a way. Musically, once I realized that all these predetermined notions of like genre
Yes.
are totally arbitrary. Again, like if it's a descriptor, then fine, right? Like I'm a human being because I like have human DNA and I like have this particular type of skeleton, this particular type of brain, etc. But if there weren't any humans around, no one would have a name for that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like that we have names for things because there are things that already exist that we need to provide names for.
Sure. And it helps us order our lives in some way, right?
Exactly. And this is why I believe that all labels should be descriptive rather than prescriptive. And so that sort of like mental shift was kind of my like shed for the past like 4 to 6 years of just like coming to terms with the fact that, oh, just because I use this term doesn't mean I have to feel a particular way all the time. Like the term that you use to define yourself, all it is for is to describe what you feel. So whatever you feel at any given time, like there's probably a word for it, but that word doesn't need to determine how you choose to behave.
Yeah, I hear you. And I read an article that came out this week about your record and your relationship with labels. And one of the things that you said is like, I hope that the next generation of people who come behind me don't feel any need to define themselves in one way or the other. And I can tell you, my daughter, who's 10, is growing up in a world where there's much more fluidity in terms of identity than certainly there was when I was growing up. I mean, when I was growing up, it was about accepting difference. You know, I mean, I think that's how we were sort of raised was, no, you can accept, there's all different kinds of people. Each of them will be labeled with some kind of terminology or sense of identity bubble, and you accept all of that. And now we've
you
tolerate. And now we're in a space where it's like, you know what? We're breaking the bubbles open. Like those bubbles aren't real. Those bubbles are just a tool for ordering the universe, and we can come up with other tools to order the universe.
Yeah, and I think that if the human race isn't destroyed by stupid people, then, you know, we're getting closer and closer to that ideal of as long as someone isn't causing pain or like hurting someone, then like just let them live, basically, which is like such a simple idea, but unfortunately like seemingly really difficult for a lot of people to grasp. But I think with every passing generation, like we get that idea becomes more and more clear and more accepted.
So what was the first step that you had to take to confront this? Because it sounds to me like maybe the first question was, am I gay and can I be out as a gay person? And then the second step, I'm guessing, is can I be out as a bi person?
I've always identified as bi, but I think within that, the bi plus umbrella, which includes a lot of things, you know, pansexual, bisexual, bi-romantic, you know, there's a lot of different terminology that goes in there. I think it's just because of the way our society is, because of like heteronormativity and the gender binary. There's something inherently confusing and challenging about being a self-identified bi person, because ideas of the legitimacy of attraction, like what do I really feel versus what I perceive society to want me to feel. How do I identify, like, say for example, like I'm a man and I'm attracted to women, right? But growing up, a large part of my conversation with myself was, I'm attracted to this person, but am I really? Like, am I just trying to placate, right, what society wants from me, or am I really attracted to this person? And there was a long time where I was like, am I gay? Like, does that term, like, is that just what it is? And I did a lot of thinking about it, and I realized, like, that's not, that term doesn't describe all of what I feel.
Yes.
And so, just like we were saying a moment ago, the term that most closely mirrors what I feel inside is bisexual. And so the definition that I use for that is the ability to feel attraction for people of my own gender and people of a different gender.
Sure. And I can imagine that once you go through this process of claiming a side, you would feel just as much pressure, if not more pressure, to only be with men. For example, if you had a narrative in your head for, so all of your childhood saying, this is, I don't know if I would ever be safe. And then you go through all of the process of coming out. There's an enormous pressure on you then to live up to that life, and you could find yourself just as boxed in, cornered.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think bi erasure is a real thing. It's a term that actually, hearing that term for the first time was actually one of the things that led me to eventually, like, coming out. I don't know if you've ever had a moment in your life where you hear a word or a term that you've never heard before, but you immediately know what it means, and you immediately realize that it's something that you've experienced.
Yeah.
Right. And I heard the term bi erasure. I'm like, oh my God, that's the thing. Because as a man, people assume that men that say they're bi are gay, and people assume that women who say they're bi are straight and they're just going through a phase, or they're just like trying to experiment to be like flirty. And so I went on tour. I was fortunate enough to go on tour with Herbie Hancock some years ago. And coming off of the high from that trip, I was just doing a lot of thinking about these things. This is around the time that I decided to make the album. I happened to be scrolling on YouTube and a video popped up, and it was called Bi Erasure, the bisexual male experience. I'm like, what is this? I have to know. And so I watched this video, and just hearing this person talk about this, I was like, yeah, oftentimes people don't want to accept that bisexuality is real because that challenges them to see the universe with more nuance. And I think unless you are naturally the sort of person who, like, enjoys looking for nuance, being made aware of nuance often can feel threatening, because it can make you feel like you're being made out to be a bad person, or like you're a blankist of some kind, be it a racist or a homophobe or whatever. And so people often meet that with fear and paranoia, etc. But for me, I'm like, bring it on. Like, the more nuance, the better. Like, I think all it is just about, like, giving space at the table for everyone to just, like, be.
I want to make it clear, I love the music that I've heard from the record. I think it is really, really fantastic, really special. And it's, like, so contemporary, but it's so classically beautiful at the same time. There's so much about it that I think is wonderful. I didn't reach out to you to talk about identity or sexuality specifically. I just want to talk about whatever. But I am curious, how are these, what do you want? What message do you want to come with? Do you want the music to be the whole story? Do you want to be able to talk about your personal journey as it ties to the music? How are you sort of seeing these questions as you now embark on rolling out a record?
Where I am with it right now is, I've always been about the music. Like, I've always, ever since I started really getting into it, I've always just let the music lead the way. And I also have always really loved to have these sorts of conversations. I love to engage intellectually with people and just, like, talk on a really deep level about things, and, like, agree and disagree and, like, explore. I don't wake up every morning saying, like, I want to be, like, a queer leader. Like, that's not something that I necessarily strive towards. But I also know the isolation of not having any role models that look like you. I think like, seeing yourself reflected in someone else is huge. And not just as a queer person, as a person of color, like, there's so many systems in place that growing up prevented me from seeing somebody that looked like me and that was like me succeeding. And so, like I said, I don't particularly, like, dream of being, like queer icon or anything like that. But like if I can serve the purpose for someone of seeing somebody being a bi black man being visible and successful and having that be helpful for them, like I'm more than happy to be that if they need me to be that.
Where do you think, where are we right now in terms of being black and queer? I mean,
Yeah.
if you can say.
Yeah, it's funny just because like my inner pessimist is definitely always part of the narrative for some reason for the past 4 or 5 years. I don't know why. Definitely we're in a way better place than we ever have been before in terms of like being out. There's a lot more representation of black and brown people in media. I still don't think that everything is fine and that, the problems are totally in the past at all. But I think that it's more viable to be out and black than it ever has been before. That being said, I do still think that there is a huge degree of tokenism that happens, like, but I think it's a necessary part of the process, right? Like, I think like a part of the process between complete invisibility to just like normal social existence without any special attention given to a particular part of yourself. Like a necessary part of that process is to shine a light and to feel a little bit uncomfortable because the light is being shown on you, for people to be afraid of that light being shown on you because they haven't had to acknowledge your existence for a long time, to have the conversations with those people, for some people to learn, for those people to not learn, for those people to eventually like go away.
Yeah.
And then eventually it just becomes a part of the fabric of society.
Right.
And I think we've seen that happen many times over the course of human history. And this is just like the current thing that's happening with. But, I think it's a journey. I can't say like, because my experience is only my own. I can't speak for everyone, but I definitely feel better now than I did growing up in this particular arena.
You said earlier that your inner voice was telling you that there would be no way to be out and safe. That there was this fear for your safety.
Yeah.
Was there a specific lack of safety that you imagined? Was it in the black community? Was it from people outside? Was there a specific fear in that you were attaching yourself to?
Definitely. I mean, there were specific fears and there were general fears. I think the general fear is like, I know that this isn't like societally kosher. So like, if I do a thing that goes against the social grain, also social grain would be a great band name. Whoever's out there, you should make that band. If I do something that goes against the social grain, then that's bad and you risk isolation. Just like general human fear of being cast aside. But then also within the black community, like it's rough. Like there's a lot of I grew up in a lot of fear that I can't be who I am in my own community, and that feels like shit. But then there's also like, in addition to that, there's also the fear of like, well, if I am attracted to a guy and I let him know, like he might punch me in the face.
Yeah.
Which like isn't a me problem, it's a him problem, but it becomes a me problem because he's so insecure in his own world.
Yeah.
And the optics of like being hit on by a guy that he feels the need to lash out. But it's like, I would suffer the consequences because of his relationship with himself. And so I think part of growing up as like a queer dude is like really looking out for and having like awareness of like, what's his deal?
Yeah.
I can't really tell, being hyper vigilant. I look forward to a world where people don't have to be hyper vigilant at all.
Yes. I've often felt that there's a kind of a complicated tension in the lack of tolerance, acceptance, openness within a community that also invented musical, artistic forms of creativity that are totally about freedom and self-expression. And I understand that it maybe is not a fair comparison, that there is generational trauma and that there are quite a few forces that are informing homophobia, hypermasculinity, prescriptive roles around men and women. But there's something about it that has always felt a little unresolved to me, that you have music, jazz, hip-hop, the blues, music born out of the Black American experience that is totally devoted to freedom. And yet often within those communities, there's a sense that that only goes so far when it comes to the personal choices of the people making it.
I've thought a lot about that as well. And I think, I think the impact of trauma is so huge, and generational trauma even more so. Like, we are still reeling from slavery, still, you know, and like the Jewish people are still reeling from the Holocaust. Like, generational trauma is like huge, and I think fortunately we live in a time where mental health is finally being recognized as something that's important to like talk about, think about, tend to understand, nurture. But I think a traumatized person hunkers down to the least nuanced version of something in order to survive, right? And I think that, I don't want to go off in a whole diatribe of like, from slavery to now, but I think a lot of gender roles tend to be like reinforced in like community-wide traumatic situations, unfortunately. And I also think that traumatized people, traumatized groups, marginalized groups tend to marginalize other groups if they don't fall within sort of the Venn diagram of like what is acceptable, because it feels like you already have to fight for your survival. So if something else that isn't cool in the eyes of like the powers that be comes near you, in order to survive, you need to shun that thing, which like isn't good, but I think makes sense. And so I think that that's what happens when you have like, the Black community not being open to queer people, or, like white women not being open to non-white women when it comes to feminist issues, or, like there's so many examples of that, of marginalized people marginalizing other marginalized people. But I think it's really just, it's just a trauma response at the end of the day.
Did you find that the queer community at large, independent of race, was more open to you than the Black community was, independent of sexuality, when you came out? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would say so in general. I mean, the main difference is that like I can't hide the fact that I'm Black, right? So like that part of me is like visible all the time, no matter what. But there's sort of something different in the nature of sexuality and gender. Well, not necessarily gender expression. That definitely is visible. So I'll say sexuality and ethnicity are different things by nature. But overall, like the queer community has been, to me, more accepting. But at the same time, like I don't want to say that like because the Black community isn't one thing. Like nothing is a monolith. And so like I have plenty of friends and family and peers, and people are wonderful. But like overall in my life, between the two groups, that's been the one group that was historically more, or like less accepting.
Let's talk about the record. By the way, I would love to do another hour with you on this. This is like, and thank you. I mean, really, thank you for your just openness. And because I agree with you, I think that I so often, despite the fact that I have these conversations on a regular basis, I come up against questions that I really want to explore, but I also want to honor people's privacy and their limits. Your work is your work and your life is your life, and they overlap and they meet and they cross and they touch, but everybody has a decision how much of that they want to share, expose, reveal.
I love to have these sorts of conversations. I mean, ask any of my friends. Like, it's sometimes like hard for me to not have these sorts of conversations, and not even in a way that's like, we need to challenge the societal blah, 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 but just in a way of like, how far can you push the human imagination to like see past what currently is? Because to me, that's what it's all about, especially in art. Like, you just want to like see the next thing, or I do at least.
You want to see the next thing, and also be, like I said, like with the stuff that I'm hearing from the record is like, it is this thing, and it's right now. I get the feeling you made the record pre-COVID. Did you make the record pre-COVID?
Yep, made it pre-COVID.
So it's not right now. I mean, for you, it's the last thing probably, and you've been sitting waiting for it, and that's a weird space to be in, where now you have to talk about something as if it's new, even though it may not reflect where you're at today.
I say that it's been burning a hole in my computer for like a year now, but I'm so excited for it to be out. I mean, even though it's, like technically it's been done for over a year, obviously, things got messed up with COVID, but I don't feel like I'm past it yet. Like, I still am kind of just like wanting it to be in the world and interact with the world and like watch it do its thing. Cause like at this point it's out of my hands,
Was it out and then was it released and then removed, or just you put a couple singles out and then waited to put the record out? Because
Exactly. Yeah. No, the record was never out. You know, it was scheduled to come out at a particular date, but then COVID came out, and then we had to COVID came, and then we had to push it. And you know, obviously none of us knew anything at the beginning of COVID. Like we all perceived different levels of apocalypse, but I thought that everything was going to have to wait until the pandemic was over. But thankfully, we were able to put out some singles. And so when I put out The Way last year, that to me was a big signifier of like, okay, like just because we're sort of treading water like collectively right now doesn't mean that like new music can't come out.
I was walking in, you were walking out. Saw that little grin, the one they told me about. Now I know that love should never be so easy, but there's something in the way you move. Something about the way you move. It haunts me. It haunts me.
Yeah. And in fact, I think in a weird way, it was very good. I think we were all stuck at home. I think the social media cycle is really hard, right? Because you put something out and it really is like throwing something out of a fourth-story window, and you just watch it fall, and then it hits the ground, and then across the street, somebody's throwing something else out a window, and there it went.
Literally.
But on the other hand, we were all captive audiences on our phones, and so, you know, there was some benefit to that. I reached out to Eli Wolf, who produced the record with you, when I first heard the singles, just to congratulate him. I've known him for a long time, and one of the things that he said was, we really worked sonically. We really spent a lot of time trying to just push it, go as far as we could go.
Yeah, I mean, the whole process of making the record from start to finish was so amazing, and I'm so thankful for Eli. Like, so before we even got into the studio, before we even actually booked the studio time, Eli and I got together for these like coffee meetings where we would just go to a coffee shop and I would play him some demos and then we would talk about it, talk about the sort of sonic universe of each of these songs. And then he would give me his ideas. I would talk about my ideas. And we did that like probably 4 or 5 times. Once things started moving forward, once we got into the studio, or rather before we got into the studio, we had a rehearsal with the band to play through all this stuff. And the band already sounded great. So it's Robin Beitas on drums, Nick Campbell on bass. Nick also plays in my Shrek is Love band. And then Andrew Friedman on keys. And these are guys that I've known for a long time. They all play in my band in either New York or LA, respectively. And the whole project felt so collaborative, which is funny because it's all my songs. It's all music that I've written. But normally when I've done stuff in the way that I know it's collaborative, right, is normally when I've done stuff in the past that is all me, that I like self-produce or whatever, you know, I can be satisfied with how it sounds. But if someone's like, man, this sounds really great, I always like, I'm sort of sheepish. I'm like, oh, thanks. Like, I'm just trying to, you know, whatever. But with this record, someone's like, man, this sounds really good. I'm like, I know, right? It totally does. And I feel okay about that because it isn't just me, it's all of us. And we all had such a large part of what the final product ended up being. And so like, I'm so thankful to all of them, and especially to Eli for just like helping wrangle and bring everything to fruition.
I love that definition of when something succeeds on a level. It is when you can legitimately take the compliment. I mean, I hear you saying, well, this isn't all you, so you know, you don't feel it as a totally personal thing. It doesn't trigger all of your own hangups and insecurities about what you could have done better or what you wanted it to be and it isn't, or for example. But there is another piece of it, which is just, you know, you hit it right when somebody pays you a compliment, and you can just accept it because you agree that you're happy with it also.
The process of, and I've never made an album before, like of my own. I've been on plenty of collaborative projects. I've been on plenty of other people's stuff, but making your own album is it's a different beast. And so like, you know, we all have our like inner little narratives and stuff. I had convinced myself that it would be impossible for me to create an album that I was like 100% happy with. I thought that I would be maybe like at most like 85% satisfied, 20% like settling.
Yeah.
I was positive, and I fucking love the record. I love it. I'm so happy with how it turned out. It feels like exactly the statement that I wanted it to be. It also feels like everyone who's on it as well. Like it doesn't, like I said, it doesn't feel like just me. It feels like everyone.
Well, I'm really excited for you that it's coming out. I know what it's like to sit on something for a long time, and it's a strange feeling. I mean, I guess we've all been sort of sitting on our lives for a year, so fortunately, you're not alone in that feeling. But I'm glad that it's coming out. And are you writing, thinking about the next one? I mean, you said you're always thinking about the next thing. How do you put out one record but be looking at the future at the same time?
I was writing more last year than I am right now, just because I'm sort of in like release mode right now. So the closer I get to the release, kind of the less I'm writing. But I have a lot of stuff cooking. Like I'm looking at album number 2 already. I don't have anything concrete, so I can't give you any like details, but I already feel myself being pulled towards new music.
Yeah.
But it's like using this music that's about to come out as like a springboard. And I also feel like I won't be able to even really know what I want the next thing to be until this is out, if that makes sense.
Do you think that's a function of how it's received or how you feel about it?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I would like to be like Buddhist and detached and say like, it's just me. How people receive it doesn't matter. But like, no, it does. But I think it has more to do with just like the through line, seeing the process through. Like, I remember the instant I was like, I need to make a record now. I remember like walking home and someone was listening to Becca Stevens, she's a friend of mine now, but she's been one of my favorite singers and composers for a long time. And I was just listening to her Perfect Animals record. I'm like, I can hear the love in this. I can hear the intention behind this, the meaning behind the songs, like the instrumentation. I hear it all and I can feel the passion. And I want to make something that makes me feel that way. I remember that exact instant. And I think going from that moment to the day that it's out, that entire arc is what is necessary for me to feel like I can actually fully move on to the next thing.
You know, I have interviewed her twice for this podcast. The first time was when Perfect Animals was coming out, and we sat in her apartment and drank a bottle of wine, which I think at the time anyway was not something that she did that often, and so she got really pretty giddy by the end of the conversation. But we talked a lot about breaking through whatever these perceived boundaries are in one's creative life, you know, and she had done something. She's not the first person to do it by any stretch of the imagination, but she is one who came through the kind of jazz door, and then she allowed herself to kind of expand and embrace all of these other elements and keep her community that she came with, and then build a new community at the same time, which, and I can imagine from your point of view, looking at that, it would be a revelation to think, I can do this. I can bring all of this past with me and I can change, and people will come with me.
Absolutely. I look at her career and the career of like somebody like Gretchen Parlato or even somebody like Nate Smith, right? Like I look at people who have started in like the jazz space and created something for themselves, but also, you know, like my music, for example, I wouldn't call it's absolutely not straight ahead jazz, but like it's not jazz. You know what I mean? Like if it was possible to like grab like a syringe and extract all the jazz from the music, like it would sound different. And so, but at the same time, like if you did that with like if you did that with like the neo soul R&B thing and extracted all that, it would sound different as well. So like, I definitely never want to cast aspersions. Am I using that word right?
I think that's well used.
Yeah, thank you. On any of these musics that have helped sort of lift me up. I just don't want to feel constricted. I want to feel, you know how like if you like take a balloon and raise the weather balloon, how it expands, the higher up it goes. Like that's what I want. Like I want the older I get for my mind to get more and more open to what's out there.
Well, like I said, we could do another hour on any one of these pieces, but before we wrap it up, is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, the French Revolution, I think is something that never get This album is something that's really personal to me that I'm really excited about, that I honestly haven't been able to see past for a long time. Like even just imagining past June 4th
Yeah.
is like, what even is that? Yeah, I'm just excited to see what the future holds, and especially now that like COVID, knock on wood, is starting to come to a tail, hopefully. I think that there's going to be a huge boom in art, and I think that there's going to be a huge boom in the scene and what the scene is going to look like. I think there's going to be a lot of struggles, especially in terms of like the economy of the scene, like the money, where's the money and donors and all that stuff. But in terms of like the desire for art, I think that it's going to be stronger than ever because we've just all been like starving for that for a year.
It's weird how in the last couple of weeks it has started to really kind of blossom. Like the spring, spring is real on a lot of levels right now. And I just have felt masks coming off, people gathering. I've been in a few places. I mean, I'm down with the mask still if the mask is the thing, but like just gigs, people going out, and I feel life flourishing again. But I also agree with you. I think it's a reset in an interesting way. Over a year ago, when we all just had to go to our rooms and think about what we've done, when I had this feeling of optimism, like maybe we will all kind of learn something from this. And so many musicians were upset about the demise of the business, but the fact is the business was very imperfect. It's not like it was some golden model of perfection in the arts. Like this might be a chance for us to reassess how the business works.
Absolutely. I mean, and reassess like what you want to do.
Yeah.
Like, how's that 4-hour $25 standards gig treating you? You know what I mean? Like, but then again, at the same time, especially being robbed of playing with people for a year, if it's with like friends,
you'll
good
take
vibes,
it.
like I'd be down just for that. But like in terms of like money making and like staying afloat, I think that there's going to be hopefully a lot more discernment now. And I think, I'm coming up with a phrase right now. Discernment is the mother of, I don't know, better paying gigs.
Yeah, of advancement.
There it is. Their discernment is the mother of advancement.
What did you get any like new chops together? Any new technique? Any new stuff? I saw a video of you like doing some percussive stuff, 3-limbed. Alan Hampton was giving you a hard time about your left foot not engaging, but like it was pretty deep. This like 3-limbed polyrhythmic thing. Is that the kind of thing maybe you worked on a little more during COVID?
Yeah, I have a drum set in my room now that a friend of mine lent to me. So I have been playing way more drums and playing more guitar. I've just been playing a lot more instruments. There was always something like kind of disconnected for me about like playing an instrument that doesn't exist in your body. And so like for the past year, I've just been trying to really get into that mindset of like the sound comes from outside of you, and that's okay, because
for you, music was always made from within, from your body.
Exactly. I mean, even like I remember in college, even just like hearing my voice come from an amp or like a monitor was like really weird. I'm like, what? It just feels really artificial. So yeah, I mean, but I'm really glad though, because now that I have a deeper understanding of these instruments, I feel like I play them with a more vocal approach, and I'm able to approach singing with a more like either internal or external like perspective.
Michael Mayo, thank you for the internal and the external perspective today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. This was fun.
There he was, my friends, the thoughtful, hip, youthful old soul that is Michael Mayo. Check out his new record, Bones, wherever you check out your music. I'll be back in your headspace next week with another deep dive. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.